So, most first novels paint on a small canvas. A domestic story, a coming-of-age tale, maybe a genre mystery, but not Tiphanie Yanique. Her debut novel, Land of Love and Drowning, which I just finished reading, is spacious enough for many voices, many registers, 3 generations of rich and poor in the Virgin Islands as they undergo political upheaval, crossings between islands and between those islands and the mainland United States, and a rich stew of legend, social realism, and magic. It's also a great read. It's even an easy read. As Ebony Magazine put it in one of any number of glowing reviews, it'll keep you coming back until the last page. One reason I suspect that Tiffany's first novel is such an electrifying, accomplished book is that she comes to the long narrative by many paths. She's published short fiction, notably the collection How to Escape from a Leper Colony, which prompted the National Book Foundation to name her as one of its 5 under 35 authors to watch. And she's published poetry, including her new award-winning collection, Wife. So her relationship to language and narrative is complex in terms of form, and her history as a Virgin Islander, that place, as she wrote just a couple of weeks ago in a New York Times op-ed on the recent hurricane season, that was traded 100 years ago by the Danish to the Americans, but retains its identity, its stories, and its vexed relationship with the rest of the U.S. And this is a quote from that op-ed. When we Virgin Islanders leave the Virgin Islands for the mainland, we find that we are immigrants in our own country. And in her poem, Dangerous Things, she puts it this way: the island is a woman, therefore dangerous things live below. Beautiful things also, which can be the most dangerous. True, we will never be beyond our histories. Tiphanie Yanique's extraordinary prose and poetry have been recognized by the 2014 Flaherty Dunn First Novel Award from the Center for Fiction, the Phyllis Wheatley Award for Pan-African Literature, the American Academy of Arts and Letters Rosenthal Family Foundation Award, the 2016 Bocas Prize in Caribbean Poetry, the United Nations 2016 Forward Felix Dennis Prize for a First Collection, and a bunch of other well-deserved honors that I won't keep you any longer while I list them, because you want to listen to her. She is Associate Professor of English at Wesleyan University, where she directs the creative writing program. Let's welcome her to Trinity.
Thank you for all those lies. Thank you also to Professor Ethan Rutherford for just being an awesome host and for inviting me. I've been so happy here this afternoon. Thank you to Christina Bolio, who is just a badass human being in all ways. I stole chocolate from her. She was cool with that. Thank you to the creative writing faculty and to the English department faculty. Thank you to my homeboy, Professor Seth Markle, for coming. And thank you to all you awesome students who really should be doing something else with your lives, but are here to listen to fiction. So I'm going to read from my novel, Land of Love and Drowning. And I was trying to decide what to read. And I decided that I would read from a section where a hurricane actually takes place. And I'm doing this in part because of what has just happened in the Virgin Islands. As some of you hopefully know, the Virgin Islands, which is where I'm from, was recently hit by 2 Category 5 hurricanes. Hurricane Irma, and then less than 2 weeks later, Hurricane Maria. And Hurricane Irma was said to be, and is still, just a month ago, the worst hurricane in history to ever hit in the Atlantic Ocean. And the Virgin Islands is made up of some tiny, tiny islands. My island, St. Thomas, is 21 miles long, 3 miles wide. And after Irma, the pictures that I was seeing were of my high school, which was actually a K through 12. I went there from 7th grade to 12th grade, underwater. That the road that I walked to go to school, now a river. That homes that I knew to be in the valley were now somehow in the ocean. And that was after the first hurricane. And then we had Hurricane Maria hit just a week and a half later. So people who were telling me, well, our roofs are gone, we have 3 of our walls left, then had to withstand another hurricane. In the meantime, our government, which is the United States government, was pretty much ignoring us in the Virgin Islands. Of course, there was a whole lot of shit was going down, right? Harvey had hit, people were devastated in Texas and in Florida by previous storms. So a lot of stuff was going on, but I remember sitting and listening to the news 4 days after Irma had hit, and people were saying, Hurricane Irma is about to hit the United States. And I was like, fuck you. Sorry to the young people in the room. It already hit the United States. It hit the United States when it hit the Virgin Islands. And the fact that that wasn't being part of the narrative really pissed me off. And then when Maria hit, the narrative continued. We are evacuating the Americans from the Virgin Islands. And of course, the Americans were the tourists. And because tourism is a sort of colonial economy, the tourists are mostly white Americans. So it was also a racialized thing that was happening. So the white people were being evacuated. And the Virgin Islanders, who are mostly of African descent, were being left behind. And those people are my family. I'm from there. And I'm not from there like some people be like, oh, I'm from there. So no, I from there. I went to school there. Like when I look at the pictures after Maria, our downtown, which is where we had a slave rebellion. In the middle of the slave rebellion, the governor freed the slaves. This is in 1848, and it happened in a place that is now called Emancipation Garden. And after Maria, Emancipation Garden is also now taken by the sea. So our main highway that was bordered the ocean is now gone. It's incredible what's happening, but this is not new. Like what's happening is actually part of a bigger fucked up thing. I'm such a curse. I'm sorry. Your kid is gonna fail kindergarten because of me. Because this is a bigger problem. And Caribbean writers right now are really beginning to write about environmental awareness more. And I think Caribbean writers, those of us who are from small islands, are taking this up as our mantle. So you'll see that writers like even Walcott, before he passed away, his last book was about the natural environment. Erna Brodber, who just won that big Yale Prize, she writes a lot about the natural environment. Even writers who before had not been writing about the natural environment, like Edwidge Danticat, who wrote a lot about immigration, is now beginning to do this, because I think this is like the shit we need to be paying attention to. And I think it's connected to immigration, because people need to get away, and where are they going to go? But also, why is it that these small places are being ignored and are suffering so much? So I'm going to read a section that's deep into the book. And all you need to know is stuff that Lucy kind of already said, which is that there's going to be some elements of magic. You're not going to know these characters because I'm on page 271. So I'm just going to start reading. You're going to be like, what is happening? Just stay with me. The only thing maybe might be fun to know ahead of time is that Annette, who's the main character, before marrying Frankie, was in love with someone named Jacob. Ethan asked me to read for 30 minutes. Are y'all able? Like, fuck no. We gotta go eat. We're undergrads, we hungry. I'll read for like 21 minutes. Some hurricanes are numbered, others are named. The latter have an identity, or persona. For years, the named storms were only women, which seemed fitting. They could be in love, they could be envious. Now, whether this hurricane was the Virgin Mary or the Magdalene, no one knew until it was too late. The island had seen storms. The houses were built for them, but the radio made it sound so serious. Why was this happening? What had we done? The cousins over in Tortola, where the storm was set to ignore, snickered. Oh, those Yankee Virgin Islanders were getting their due punishments for their relentless excess. After all, the spoils of tourism have been flooding the USVI for years. Now, hurricanes, like all important things, happen by the generation. Yumi and Frank, the children, thought that they were a thing of Caribbean folklore like pirates and mermaids, or of Caribbean myth like Auntie Iona's Duende and Anansi. But because they were mythic, Yumi also knew that they would return because Yumi believed in all the stories. As the radio directed, the family put up a map distributed by the government and drew a line from where the hurricane had started off the coast of Africa. They gridded in the latitude and longitude. This was a game that the community played collectively. We all watched Mary grow, a mutant baby, as she traveled across the Atlantic. Then Mary was there, knocking on the door. Everyone was nervous and a little excited. No school, early off from work, all the bustling about, and Mervyn Manatee announcing on the radio, get ready, Hurricane Mary is coming. Now, Frankie was a Coast Guardsman, and so he was the type to prepare. He sent Annette out with Yumi to buy batteries to keep things working and nice things to eat in case the storm made anyone morose. Frankie and his son heaved a thick sheet of wood and nailed it over the windows at the front of the house. He called over to St. John and made sure that someone would pass and check on Auntie Iona's inn. After he'd secured their home, he went to check on his lighthouse. The Coast Guard had relieved him of lighthouse duty until after the storm, for it would be too dangerous. All the ships in the area had been alerted, and when he returned, Frankie ordered everyone to move all the valuables up onto the highest shelves. Now, Annette was a historian. And though she didn't teach Virgin Islands history because none of the schools thought it necessary, she still listened for the local stories, and Annette had heard about the long ago tidal wave that swam the waterfront and washed up at the Anglican Church, and she'd been told about the ancient earthquake that had knocked down the Peterson building, and she knew about the old cholera that had taken a son from every family like a proper plague, and she knew about the sinking of the Homecoming. That was all history. Now at their house, Frankie was telling a story about the one time he had saved someone from drowning. In all his honorable years with the Coast Guard, this was the only time he'd saved anyone. Everyone said that Mary was an angry woman's storm. Either a jilted lover or a desperate mother. With a name like Mary, we should have known that she would be the worst ever. No one was prepared. The separate portrait of the grandparents was off the wall and packed up. The cruise ships had just turned away and headed for Jamaica. Ronalda's dorm was called and called, but she was at a SNCC meeting and didn't get home until curfew, which was 7 p.m. Phone curfew was 9, and at 8:45, she finally returned the phone calls and said, "But Mommy, there's nothing on the news here about a hurricane hitting the VI at all. It's going to be okay." But then Iona called from St. John and said, "Listen clearly, Annette. It's not going to be okay." Then the rain was fighting to come into the house, and then pieces of galvanized tin were knocking on the door, and then the wind sounded like a woman howling out her broken heart. The radio stopped mixing its mix of American soul and island quilby, and frantic men and women and children started calling in and screaming that their roofs were tearing off their homes, that their children had gone out into the rain. "Help! We live in Tutu. We live in a new housing development. We live still. Save us." The call came over the radio that all emergency personnel were needed, all police and doctors and firemen, and of course, the Coast Guard. Report now, immediately. When that call for emergency personnel came over the radio in the Joseph house, Frankie looked over at his Annette. "I have to go," he said. Frankie was in the Coast Guard, but he'd never dealt with a major emergency. When he joined the Coast Guard, there hadn't even been formal training for that sort of thing. Most of his work was keeping the lighthouse, for goodness sake, and despite that, he'd never even seen a ship wrecked. He wasn't a surfman or even a coxswain. He'd once saved a drowning person on Koki Beach when he was off duty. That was it. But he was going anyway. Annette watched him dress. Her husband was a seaman in a way, but the sea seemed as though it had swiveled upside down, was coming down on top of them. They would soon drown. Annette watched how Frankie put on the heavy boots and jacket that he wore when they'd all gone to the States just a month ago to see Ronaldo settle. They hadn't thought much of America then. It had rained in the morning and the afternoon and into the night without even one break for sun. And who had ever heard of such a thing? Raining all day. But now it was indeed raining all day. And Annette was glad that at least one of her children was away from here. But Papa Frankie wished that Ronaldo was here. She was the child he most trusted to be in charge. "I'm gonna be fine, Annie. Izamana is. You be safe. You don't give me cause to worry." Annette nodded and felt the tears behind her cheekbones. Her husband had never called her a nickname, Annie, before. It seemed too intimate for the time, as though there was something grave between them that must be given a sweetness. The rain was knocking hard against the back windows. In the living room, Yumi and Frank had gathered, unable to sleep. It was 1 a.m. Frankie didn't like the idea of everyone there saying goodbye to him. He wasn't going to his death. He was going to save lives. He would be heroic. He would return. Annette didn't like it either. Her firstborn child was safe but so far away. Her sister was safe and closer but not safe enough. And Annette wanted most to be with the one she loved and who loved her. Frank hugged his father. Then Frankie went to Yumi and tapped her gently as though she were a small child. Finally, he kissed his Annette on the mouth, which was not something the children had ever seen them do before. Frankie opened the heavy front door with a fierce push. The rain came sleeting into the living room. They all gasped and stepped back. Frankie stepped forward. He slammed the door behind him. Annette looked at the closed door, still seeing her husband's back and the storm before him. Then Annette wished Frankie would die. Just a simple, shocking wish, just the desire that Frankie never return. Wouldn't everything be fine if Frankie would drown? Our hero's death wouldn't be so bad. Then wouldn't Annette have done her duty, stayed by him all these years because he'd stayed by her? Then she would be free, and then Jacob Mackenzie would arrive instead. Well, how strange to discover that Jacob was still among her best beloveds, and not even among but above. Annette hadn't wished anyone dead in so many years, and here she was wishing it on her husband. Now Yumi looked at her mother standing at the door and knew exactly what Annette was thinking. She found her mother's thoughts peculiar, for hadn't she and Papa Frankie just kissed? Why would Mommy think such an awful thing? That she could read her mother's mind did not strike Yumi as peculiar at all. It seemed something that anyone could do, something family should do for each other. It struck Annette differently. She felt the intrusion in her thoughts as though someone had broken a window in her house. There was a crack and then a moment of fear, and then she turned slowly to look at Yumi watching her. They stared at each other until Yumi's eyes watered and she felt she was doing something wrong. Me? Annette said in her head, and Yumi heard her pet name echo in her own ears. Me? Then the child did what she would only do for her mother. She turned away. Besides, Annette didn't really want Frankie gone. He was a good father to all the children, a good husband to her. She would be devastated. She wouldn't know how to be a sensible woman. How would she cook saltfish without his pepper sauce? She barely knew how to cook at all. No, she didn't want Frankie dead. It was just that she wanted Jacob, that was all. She just wanted Jacob to come, to take her and to hold her and to be her husband like he had promised. She hadn't felt such foolishness in years, and it was foolishness. She was just scared. She was just feeling abandoned because of the storm. Annette focused on the door again. She stood staring at the door for a long time, conjuring the image of Frankie's back at the threshold, keeping him alive, overriding her earlier heedless thoughts. Jacob is married, she now reminded herself, not free to claim her, even if she were free to be claimed. And who says he would be a good husband to her anyway? Who says they would still be in love now if she had been his attainable wife and he her attainable husband? Leave that alone, she told herself. Frankie is your man. Frankie is who you need. Annette walked to her daughter and pulled Yumi's face to hers. You be careful in other people's heads, she said out loud. Then she released Yumi and went to the kitchen to gather a supply of candles and matches. The candles that had been lit were already melting. At 5 a.m., Annette picked up the phone to call the lighthouse and check on Frankie. She found her phone line dead. Frank Jr. turned the transistor radio on high. Mervyn Manatee was declaring that everyone should open their windows. This would prevent implosion. This would prevent the pressure inside the house from rising and blowing the roof off. Frank opened the windows in the back of the house. The photo albums were sopping wet. They all felt their ears popping as they watched the roof. This was now a wild woman storm. Frank kept checking on the latches and the locks as his father had instructed. Even though he was the youngest, no one told him to settle down. He seemed professional and military-like, and Annette observed him with a mother's secret pride, that mix of attraction and protection. The radio, on the other hand, was spewing horror. The hurricane had slowed down its movement, had stopped altogether, and settled over the Virgin Islands, dumping destruction like something premeditated and biblical. Police were radioing in. This home is gone. That roof is gone. Then the directives of meek advice. Hide in the bathtub. Pull a mattress over your head. Afterwards, they would hear the stories of entire families who stuffed themselves into bathtubs with mattresses over them as their houses fell in. Help us. Help is coming. The Coast Guard is coming. The police are coming. And where is the doctor? Where are you? What is your address? Hello? Hello? The eye of the storm finally passed over the eye. A perfect metaphor for so many things. There was quiet all over the land, a peace, a light rain, sunshine coming from the unboarded back windows of the house. The radio warned not to leave your home because no one could know how long this calm would last before Mary started up again. Frank, who was baby-faced but almost a teenager, wrapped blankets around his body. Annette pretended she didn't notice he was heading out. She didn't think she could stop her son, so she didn't want to try and fail. There was something determined in him. In this chaos, he seemed suddenly to be a man, and later when he was fighting in the revel in Grenada, she would tell this story of him going out into the eye. But now Frank pulled the door that Frankie had left through and had not yet returned through, and Frank went out into the stillness. Yumi and Annette laid sheets in bundles under all the doors and at the base of the windows to keep out the water that was seeping in. They didn't put any at the front door until Frank finally returned. When he did, a half hour later, he looked scared and brave. "I looked into the eye of the storm," he said. Not a bumpsy come in. The front of Mary had been bad, but her tail, like any Caribbean backside, was worse. Hurricane Mary lasted for 2 days. Mary was pissed. Then she eased away, sassy and slow and satisfied. In the afternoon after the hurricane, Yumi and Annette waded through the neighborhood. The ancient mahogany tree had been uprooted and thrown down the gutter. There was an actual Maytag refrigerator lying on its side in the middle of the road. Most curious of all was the neighbors at the bottom of the street. In the middle of the debris, there was a bed, still standing, its headboard and all its sheets still tucked tightly, its pillows still plump at the head, while the entire rest of the house lay in splinters. If the bed had been a cross or a saint statue, everyone would have said it was God's miracle. Instead, Annette looked at it for a long while. But Frankie's house had oddly and completely survived. When retrieved, the ancient picture of the grandparents seemed fresher than it had before. But life was changed on the island. It was not something new. It was not something opening or awakening. It was an expired life, even though only 3 people had died on all 3 islands, and they had been tourists. We had to climb over people's lives to get down the street. There were kitchen tables in the road. There were dressers crashed up against cars. And worst of all, those living in the valley could see the bare hills. There were houses there, so many houses. When had those houses been built? Who lived in them? And why were they so huge? These weren't homes that connected to the regular streets. These were way up. The townspeople just hadn't been paying attention. Yes, we owned our own land and our own houses, and yet it was something to realize that we were looked down upon, to realize all of a sudden that we didn't live in the prime location at all, not anymore. And 24 hours after he walked out of the door, Frankie came home a hero, but not dead. He picked up his wife, forgot, and he spun her around and around, and he told her, "Thank God for life. Thank God for life. Thank God for this life." Thank you. I will take questions.
There's always this awkward pause, and the professor always has to ask the first question.
What? I'm a professor. I will stay here and wait for you to ask me some questions. I am used to giving my students stone face and being like, what? Come on now. Who's brave? Who's the brave one?
See, none of them was, so I...
Oh, don't let her boss you around. What the hell?
If they feel like they're not allowed to.
Oh my gosh. Come on, Trinity. Don't embarrass yourselves. All right, here we go.
So, just like Hurricane Mary, that was an actual event that happened, correct? So, like, just because I wanted to understand the historical context more, so like, when did it happen, and did it like affect, like how did it affect your family specifically?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Do I need the thing? Okay. Do we need a thing for that thing?
No, it's
Okay. Hurricane Mary is not an actual hurricane. The hurricane that hit my islands that I experienced was Hurricane Marilyn. And that hit in 1996. I was a senior in high school. And we didn't have electricity for 3 months. And as happens in the following chapter of the book, I had to wait in bread lines and eat meal ready to eat that the Army rations, the Army provided for us. FEMA came to help us, but eventually the military was sent down, which sucked because the military is an occupying force. And actually the military is not allowed to serve on American soil. So were they serving on our soil? Why didn't they just send FEMA and Red Cross? But we had the Army, as we do now. Right now, the Virgin Islands, well, we don't have FEMA, we have the Army in the Virgin Islands now. So, I experienced that, which is aid workers with guns, which is a really problematic way to receive help. So, yeah, I lived through that. Good job. You did it. Okay, now I'll take a professor credit.
I want to ask a question.
Okay.
So, a little bit in the section that you read, but throughout the book, there's, you do a lot of, switches between first and third person and so forth, but the voice that you often come back to, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you came up with it and how it was working for you, is a sort of a first person plural, a sort of we, and it is people of the island. I sensed it was women of the island. And I wonder how fixed or amorphous that voice was for you, where it came from, and how for you it functions in the book.
So the book has about 5 different voices, 5 different points of view. It's Annette, who you saw in third person in this section, Jacob, who you just heard referenced, the sister Iona, who you also heard referenced, she calls in at one point, and the sort of third person plural that you're talking about. And they all, so it's 4, they all speak in different registers of Virgin Islands vernacular. Iona speaks in the most educated, highfalutin, Europeanized version of Virgin Islands vernacular. Annette speaks in the most vernacularized version of it. And then the third person plural, who is the main God narrator of the whole book, changes over time. So that third person is aware of speaking the history of the island and begins in a much more formal tone and then takes on the vernacular throughout the book with more confidence as the Virgin Island people get more confident with our identity. So because the book takes place from our transfer from Danish to American rule up until the 1970s, when we finally get to have our own voting legislative bodies. So for me, the third person plural is the woman. I think at some point I even say that it's the old wives of the island. At some point the third person says, we old wives.
Yeah.
And I wanted to reclaim this whole mythical idea of the old wives. My grandmother was a storyteller. She was a librarian. My mother was a librarian. I'm raised by librarians. And I wanted to show value to the stories. It's so dismissive. That's an old wives' tale, which means that's a stupid story of lies told by dumb old women. And I wanted to say, actually, no. I mean, there's so much wisdom in those old wives' tales. And actually, these old wives are the ones that are preserving the history of the Virgin Islands, because it's not in the textbooks. Because being a colonized state, which is what we are in the Virgin Islands, means that you don't get to have history books. So you only get to carry it down in this oral way. And in fact, there's really not a Virgin Islands literature. My novel is maybe one of the first novels by a Virgin Islander about the Virgin Islands. So I was very aware when I wrote this novel that I was beginning our literature. And so I wanted to have that voice that spoke more broadly. But I also wanted to have multiple voices that communicated our vernacular complexity. So it was important to me, even though it's all me, that I at least give the portrayal of multiplicity in the novel.
Just sort of building off of that, because I'm from the Caribbean as well, I was wondering, if you can talk a little bit about how that shapes your writing, or how being from the Caribbean shapes what you write about.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I used to in the beginning, and now I think people don't ask me anymore because they're scared of me. I used to get questions like, are you a Caribbean writer? like, well, you always write about the Caribbean. And I'd be like, do you ask like white boys if they're white boy writers? And if they'll always write about white boy shit? So I used to, and I feel like we don't do that, right? So I feel like for me, when I say I'm a Caribbean writer, I'm saying like I am a world writer, right? I'm saying that within the Caribbean context, I can write the whole universe, which I believe. I really believe that to be true. And I think that I believe that in one selfish way, that I think the Caribbean is the crossroads of the globe. It's where the New World and the Old World came to meet. It's the point of the triangular trade, but also because any one ethnic experience can tell the world experience, right? So that's the other part of the truth, is that you can write, if you're writing truthfully and honestly, you are gonna write the world. And I wanted to hold that tight and true. I would say that I'm a Virgin Islands writer first, and that's a political decision because we don't have a literature. And I the more I say it, the more I make it true, because I believe in that kind of magical power, like you say it and then it comes, because I'm a writer. And so I believe that words are powerful in that way. But I would say that I'm a Caribbean writer because I learned to understand myself as a writer when I went on my Fulbright right after undergrad. And I did a Fulbright to Jamaica and Trinidad, and I started reading Caribbean literature. And that's when I began to think of myself as being part of a tradition. Before that, I thought I was like just writing, like navel gazing. Like we do when we're undergrads. Right? Like I thought I was like, I'm writing about me and all my dumb stuff and like my selfish blah, 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 boring, blah, blah, blah. And then like when I began to read in the tradition of the Caribbean, I thought, no, like writing about Tiphanie is not enough. I'm writing about like an entire history, an entire people. And so I think of myself as a Caribbean writer aesthetically, that I'm writing through the various vernaculars of the region, through the various histories of the region, through the various racial realities of the region. Like I feel like I can write without any question a Hindu girl from Trinidad because I'm a Caribbean girl and so is she. And so that gives me access to her reality, even though I'm not Indian or Hindu, right? And so for me, like I feel like I have access to all Caribbean possibilities. And I felt that when I began to study Caribbean literature. So while I feel like politically, I claim that I'm a Virgin Islands writer, aesthetically, I feel like the Caribbean aesthetic is my way into humanity, and that's my way into character development. That's my way into writing fiction.
So the books are in different points of view. Did you find that it was natural and it came easy to switch into those different voices and different personalities, or did you wake up and you're like, okay, today's a Jacob day, like let's get going? Like,
There were 10 before. Really, the book was like twice or 3 times as long. There were like 10 different voices. I was really obsessed with the voices thing. And then I was like, this is crazy. What am I doing? Like my political project was getting away with my aesthetic project. And I realized I had to like pare back on like my agenda and write a beautiful book. And to do that, I had to pull back on some of the voices. People write about my work and say that I'm really strong with voice and first person narrative. So like when reviewers talk about my work, that's what they talk about. But it's not true, actually. Like the truth is that I work really hard at first person voice. I didn't read from it today, but yeah. Maybe I'll read a little bit. I'll read you just a little bit of Annette. I'll read a short section from Annette. Okay, super tiny, short, like a page. Let me tell you something I know about Anegada, because I learned plenty some things with this hard head of mine. I don't remember nothing of my life before I turned 4 years old, but I don't need memory, a historian, that's me after all. I ain't never been Anegada, but I know enough. In all my years, I had never wanted to chase a child. I had want every child I ever conceived. Not every woman have that, and she. I can't speak for those women, but I know that Anagata wasn't a place to do nothing except make love. I mean, you know the place? You even ever seen a postcard of Anagata? It's too pretty. Like heaven and hell marry up and birth up all the beauty and goodness badness could possibly make. You hearing me? And when you raise up in that place, like how my mama had raised up in that place, you only know about beauty and how to make it. And love making is a beauty making. So it ain't nothing to imagine that my mama come pregnant when she young, probably by a nice boy, a lobster fisherman who have legs like bronze. And if this so, you can't blame she. Everybody loving and beautifying, and the man sweet and tender. Besides, they have maybe 15 boys and 15 girls on the whole island. Of course, they're going to meet up and mix up and mate up, and all of them is the most beautiful people you ever dream. So, that voice is actually, that's my native language, and yet I didn't know how to write that voice. Because I wasn't trained in my creative writing classes to do that, right? I was trained to do the third person narrative. And in fact, I wouldn't even say creative writing classes, I would say even in what I read in my literature classes, didn't train me to do this. So I had to train myself, and I didn't want to write, like often when you write the vernacular, it's only funny, and the vernacularized character is like a buffoon, and that's racist. So I didn't want to do that, right? I wanted to write a vernacularized character that was intelligent, so she's my historian. I wanted to write the vernacular that was poetic, and I tried to infuse that there. So I had to do a lot, I had to teach myself how to do that. And actually Caribbean literature helped me so much because Sam Selvin and even Walcott to some extent were attempting to do lots of similar things with their vernacular. But I had to learn that kind of stuff. So now people say that's what she's so good at, that's what's natural to her because, black girl magic or something. I can sing and dance, Actually that third person narrative that I read from is what comes naturally to me. Because that's how I was trained. That's how I learned, that's what I read growing up, that's what I learned in creative writing workshop. And so I have to actually be a much more stealthy craftsperson when I write in first person. But it's one of those things that sometimes the thing you work harder at is the thing that that's the thing that glows for people. Yeah, but it's not my natural thing, yeah.
So what was the thing that sort of started this story for you? Was it the characters, the setting? Where did you start, and then how did you get everywhere else?
In the beginning. So I'm a poet also, and I write short stories. This novel took me 11 years to write. And while I was writing this novel, I was also writing my story collection, and I was also writing my poetry collection, and also writing essays, which I write as well. So for me, I need to have a couple of things on the pot and just taste everything and move. And when I get bored, I do something else. So that keeps me still excited about my project. For me, this novel really began on my grandmother's knee. The narrative of the captain is my family story. So in early 1900s, right when the Virgin Islands is being transferred from Danish to American rule without our say, my great-grandfather drowns on his ship. His ship goes down, he goes down with it. It's such an important ship in the Virgin Islands that it's said when his ship goes down, every family in the Virgin Islands loses someone on that ship. My grandmother was 3, she was the baby of the family, and she was orphaned, as was everyone in the family. And so my family went from being a family of wealth, which was a captain was a wealthy person, to a family of poverty. And in fact, I grew up very poor. I grew up totally, so bad. I grew up in a hood where as a tourist, you would never go. Or you might get shot. So, and now I'm a professor, which feels fancy, but that's not my upbringing. So for me, that narrative of the Virgin Islands becoming American and losing the patriarch of Denmark, and trying to figure out what we are nationally, what our national identity is, and the narrative of my family, where we lost our patriarch and we were trying to figure out like what it means to be this family. I thought those were like the same narrative actually, and so I used like those two things were things I was always grappling with, and then I used my grandmother's real true narratives to begin to build the story. So what the first chapter of this novel is the chapter that I submitted to grad school, to get into grad school. So I was writing it from the beginning. And in fact, I used the stories in my collection, How to Escape from a Leper Colony, to teach myself specific things that I knew I had to master to write the novel. So like in my story collection, there are some stories that are about voice. Like I know I want to write this multi-voice novel, and I don't know how to do that. So let me teach myself, and I taught myself in like smaller spaces. Or like I know I want to write a complex structure, which is this is sort of strangely and complexly structured. And so I have stories in the collection that are just like me working through structure. So those stories were serving the novel. They were serving themselves as well, but they were also serving my like gleaning of skills so that I could feel like I achieved mastery to write this novel. Because I knew I had to kill this novel. Like I knew because of what the novel means in the Virgin Islands, and I knew what it was going to mean for the Virgin Islands, that it just had to land with a slam. I couldn't fuck it up. Like I had to write a beautiful novel, and I needed to learn stuff first, which is to say, I think sometimes we're like rushing to get our first book out, and those of you who are writers might feel that compulsion, like gotta get my book out, gotta be published. And what you really want is to be published well. Like what you really want is to be like, pow, right? You don't want to be like, and for me that meant it took me 11 years to write my first novel, and that was okay because I was confident that I was going to write a really, really good novel. Yeah. Thank you guys so much.